Well, good morning, everyone. My name is John Hamre. I'm the president of the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington, D.C. And we have a real privilege today to host an event on behalf of a fellow think tank, the Paulson Institute. Of course, the Paulson Institute it was organized by and is still being run by Hank Paulson. Hank is very, very well known here in Washington because he was the Secretary of Treasury at a time when America had a great financial crisis. And we were very fortunate that a man of his expertise and skill was the Secretary of Treasury during such a critical time. And so we're delighted that Hank will moderate this conversation. We also are very, very privileged to have two really leading senators who are going to be participating in this, Senator Chris Coons and Senator Dan Sullivan. Most members of the Congress represent a district or represent a state. A few of them are larger leaders, and they actually are national leaders. And I would say that's very much the case for both Senator Coons and for Senator Sullivan. We're really delighted that they can be a part of this program. And then there's going to be a remarkable panel conversation by five exceptional intellects who have been following trade policy for many, many years. First I'd say Jeff Bader. Dr. Jeff Bader is one of the premier Asian policy experts in the United States, and we're delighted that he's going to be able to join us. Wendy Cutler. Wendy is she's the senior vice president at the Asia Society, and she is a remarkable leader and a true trade expert. She is known, and her ideas are sought out everywhere for her leadership in trade policy. We are delighted that Pascal Lamy is with us, and of course, Mr. Lamy was the EU trade representative, and it was very well known here in the United States. He was a tough but extremely effective trade representative for the European Union, and we're delighted he's joining us. Special welcome and thanks to Bob Zoellick. Bob Zoellick was the U.S. Trade Representative. Bob's held almost every position you can imagine. Bob was the U.S. Trade Representative, was the Deputy Secretary of State, and is really one of the premier thinkers, foreign policy thinkers, and has had a strong focus and interest in Asia, and we're so grateful that he's here. And then finally, Kevin Rudd, the Honorable Kevin Rudd, who was Prime Minister of Australia. Kevin has just charted a whole new professional direction, and he's at the Asia Society and is leading their China program. Just published a remarkable book, really a powerful book and insight. How do we avoid a war between China and the United States? And it's these leaders that are going to be with us today. It's going to be a rich conversation. And so, with no further delay on my part, let me turn to Hank Paulson. Hank, thank you for the opportunity for us to do this with you.
Thank you, John, and thank you to CSIS for your partnership today. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. Today's event is occurring against a backdrop of great human tragedy, and of course, Russia's war against Ukraine has also challenged Europe's security architecture and roiled geopolitics. It has threatened global economic growth, energy and food security, and exacerbated rising inflation. Developing economies who stand to benefit most from free and open trade will be hardest hit. The war in Ukraine has also forced us to reckon with the reality that the post-Cold War global economy is entering a new and more uncertain era. For a number of years now, we've been living through a generation-defining battle between the forces of openness and closure. And unfortunately, closure has a wind at its back, and it's being driven by increasing pressure to decouple global supply chains, an outdated and weakened WTO that does not address today's challenges, particularly in the digital world, and an adverse political environment and the weaponization of trade globally, and a lack of support from those who do not feel they benefit from more open markets. In the short term, the war in Ukraine will disrupt the global trading environment. The West's sanctions against Russia are unprecedented in their speed, scope, and severity, and they are entirely necessary. The question is, what happens next? When we come out of the other side of the war, what will be the long-term trajectory for global trade? Will countries find a way to strengthen the WTO and work multilaterally? Or will we continue to see more regional and bilateral deals that cut out big parts of the world? Will trade policy become primarily a punitive tool used to close and limit markets? Or will it be used to drive economic growth and to build partnerships and alliances? If the United States limits its trading relationships to other like-minded democracies, for example, will it affect our ability to remain competitive? My concern is that we may be headed down a path of economic isolation. I fear that if America does not reassert its leadership on trade, our economic competitiveness, which is the foundation of our national security, will be diminished. And I expect China will eagerly continue to fill the vacuum we have left. In short, we are in danger of creating an economic iron curtain, one that decouples world supply chains and erects incompatible rules and standards throughout the global economy, impeding innovation and economic growth. Of course, there's nothing inevitable about this future. I believe that with the right policies, choices, and with the political will, we can craft an American-led trade agenda that sets us up for success in the decades ahead. At this stage, however, there are many more questions than answers. Fortunately, we have a world-class group of policy experts to help us sort through some of these questions. They will help us look beyond the United States and share perspectives from Europe and also from Asia. John has already covered the introductions, so let's dive right in. Senator Coons, over to you.
Thank you very much, Secretary Paulson. I'm grateful for this opportunity to join CSIS, the Paulson Institute, and my friend and colleague from Alaska, Senator Sullivan. Senator Sullivan was gracious enough to join a USGLC convened conversation about America's place in the world with me in Delaware. And I was thrilled he asked me to return the favor today by joining this conversation about America's role in the world and an appropriate trade agenda for the 21st century. Mr. Secretary, I could not agree more with you that the tragedy unfolding because of Russian aggression in Ukraine is going to shape and form the trade agenda and the international economic field for the 21st century. As many of us stay up late into the night watching with horror the latest reports about human rights abuses, and as we watch Putin's forces grind great cities of Ukraine into dust, much as they did with Grozny and with Aleppo. We are first heartened by the way in which the West came together quickly. I am encouraged by President Biden's effective leadership in pulling together a muscular response from NATO, from the EU, from Western allies and partners, even countries that sat out the Second World War, like the Swedish and the Swiss, have imposed sanctions and sent material aid to the Ukrainians. But on the other side of this war, the end to which we must all work very hard to achieve and ensure that Putin does not win in Ukraine and that Ukraine, under President Zelensky's inspiring leadership, is able to hold off Russian aggression. On the other side of that, we do have a pressing question. And Hank, as you put it, the question is whether or not the United States will be increasingly economically limited in its scope and reach to like-minded countries, to other open Western societies, or whether we will continue to have a broader global economic leadership. You raised the question of whether there might be, in this century, an economic iron curtain, that if, and I'm just expanding on your remarks, if countries like Russia, China, perhaps even somehow Saudi Arabia or India, Venezuela, Iran, or others, form an economic partnership of the sanctioned and the sanctionable, and we lose the unique status and power of the United States dollar as the reserve currency, and developments in the financial field create opportunities that weaken our sanctions capabilities. And if we, for a variety of security and human rights and technological reasons increasingly decouple from countries like Russia or perhaps even China, what will the consequences be? I've long been a free trader, someone who thinks that expanding opportunity around the world has the possibility of moving other countries towards democracy and towards open societies, market societies. This is a tough decade in which to still be making that argument, as we've seen a sharp turn by the PRC under Xi Jinping's leadership, and we've seen the rise of autocracies in a dozen countries around the world, and the slide of democracy. I support President Biden's initiative to invest more in democracy. I'm grateful for Senator Sullivan's leadership of IRI, of the board of the International Republican Institute, and I've introduced bipartisan legislation to update and strengthen the tools that we have available to advance democracy. We need to do a better job of funding the activities and the engagements, the civil society, and the free and open elections that make democracy possible. And we need to be more actively engaged in pushing back against the digital tools of surveillance, authoritarianism, and repression that China has sharpened, applied successfully against its own people, whether the Uyghurs in Xinjiang or in their brutal crackdown in Hong Kong, and are now exporting to other countries around the world. I suspect that Senator Sullivan and I will agree today that the United States must more actively engage in its leadership role as the country that for many stands as the example of what a democratic society can be. I will add that I think we in Congress need to show that we can listen to each other, we can compromise, we can legislate. I thought last year's bipartisan infrastructure bill was a critical demonstration of our ability to put down the tools of partisanship and to take up the tools necessary to rebuild and reinvest in the infrastructure, both the traditional infrastructure of roads and bridges and highways and modern digital infrastructure, access to broadband that helps modernize our society. It is my hope that this year we will see the House and Senate, after a conference, finally take up, pass, and send to President Biden's desk a robust bill based on the USICA, or the Competes Act in the House, that modernizes our partnership, our investment in our own country in things like the NSF and in the semiconductor chips industry, but also investment in our partners in the Indo-Pacific. Let me move to my last point, if I could. I think we have an opportunity to reshape our trade agenda, and in particular, our trade agenda in the Indo-Pacific for this century. And I think the platform for progress in this area was laid under the last administration when NAFTA was updated. The USMCA, which binds together Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and one of the largest trading regions in the world, had updated standards for the digital age, had modernized intellectual property standards, had improved labor and environmental standards, and was ratified by both Republicans and Democrats in the House and Senate and signed into law by President Trump. It contained many of the provisions that were hammered out in the TPP, and I think begins to point us in a positive direction forward. In the 21st century, a trade agenda is less about lowering tariffs and more about setting standards in the digital era for whether or not individuals have rights to their own data, whether or not companies or increasingly states are the ultimate actors in the determination of what counts as free speech and what sorts of data will be shared on what terms between individuals, companies, and states. And I do think for those of us committed to liberty, to free speech, and to open societies, there's an opportunity for us to work together with the EU, UK, Canada, Australia, South Korea, Japan, India, a dozen other countries committed to open democratic societies, to set standards for what privacy and commerce will look like in the digital world. Frankly, we must act, and act with some urgency, because the tools of digital repression are only becoming more forceful, more effective, and more widespread. Last, I'll suggest from my perspective, we need to strike the right balance between American energy independence, which is a source of great economic strength for us, and a means for us to come to Europe's aid and to help them wean themselves off of reliance on Russian gas and oil. But we must also redouble our efforts to show climate ambition that aligns with our European partners and our North American partners. Senator Kevin Cramer, Republican from North Dakota, relatively recently published a thought piece with General McMaster, H.R. McMaster, former National Security Advisor to President Trump, about the wisdom of adopting a border carbon adjustment, something that would align our heavy industry and the tariffs on imported goods from heavily polluting countries like, for example, China. If we could align a border carbon adjustment between the United States, UK, EU, and Canada, just for starters, we would incentivize manufacturing in the United States of things like steel and aluminum, cement and fertilizer, and we would disincentivize the import of products from heavily polluting countries that don't have the same regulatory standards for labor and environment that we do. I think this is a promising opportunity. And in conclusion, I'll just mention, first, I am grateful for Senator Sullivan's partnership as we've worked together on U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. And last, I would look forward to the input of the great folks on the panel that will succeed us and anyone who's watching today on the ideas that I've tossed out here relatively briefly of how we might better align American values, interests, and priorities with a newly formed digital and climate agenda for trade for the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you for your leadership, your bipartisan leadership on geopolitical and economic issues. Thank you very much. And now we're going to hear from Senator Dan Sullivan from Alaska.
Well, thank you, Hank. And I just want to compliment my friend, Secretary Paulson, and really compliment him on his leadership on so many of these issues over the years, and so many of the fellow participants and panelists. From my perspective, having Chris Coons participate is great, but I will also say whether it's Kevin Rudd or Bob Zellick or Wendy Cutler, these are people that I've known for a long time, learned a ton from, including Secretary Paulson, where I had the chance to, when I was an Assistant Secretary of State in the Bush administration, traveled to China with Hank many times, and Bob Zellick when I was at the NSC and worked with Wendy. So, but I'm only saying that because when you disagree with me on anything I say, you can feel free to disavow it. I'm not going to blame any of you guys for my ideas that you may or may not agree with, but it's great to be able to participate in this. We are in a new era of authoritarian aggression, and this is led by Russia and China's dictators, Putin and Xi Jinping. There's a lot of similarities here. These leaders are increasingly isolated. I think that the biggest fear, again, that Putin and Xi Jinping have is a long-term, enduring, strategic, bipartisan policy in the United States, the way containment was during the Cold War, that we can develop and move forward on together. We're not there yet, but that is happening. It is no doubt happening. Just this week in the U.S. Senate, we are working on what's called the Competes Act, or USECA. It was earlier called the Endless Frontiers Act. But this is a very massive bill, very focused on making sure that we can outcompete China as it relates to basic research, the technology race, and things like quantum computing and AI. And these are all areas where Democrats and Republicans, particularly in the Senate, are coming together. You know, Bob Zellick, again, I think gave probably one of the best speeches many years ago, the responsible stakeholder speech, as it relates to our strategy with regard to China. My view is they've completely, that country, the leadership of that country, has completely rejected any idea of a responsible stakeholder in the Western-led order that the United States developed after World War II. So what are the areas that we need to focus on together? Well, not just technology, but Senator Van Hollen and I have legislation that's actually in the USECA bill focused in demanding reciprocity in all spheres of the U.S.-China relationship. You are all experts. You know we haven't had reciprocity in the spheres of our relationship for decades. When you press the Chinese on it, which I do regularly, they say, well, we know we don't have reciprocal relations. That's because we're a developing country. Believe it or not, they still use that talking point. I find it ridiculous, but that's an area where Americans, senators, Democrats, Republicans are coming together. As I mentioned, reinvigorating our competitiveness to outcompete China and other countries and to out-innovate them. Rebuilding our military and our strength. I know Hank has been talking about the concerns that he has with regard to an economic iron curtain as it relates to U.S.-China trade. Let me give a bit of a different take on that. I think the pandemic was a real wake-up call for the citizens of the United States. I hear this repeatedly from Alaskans that I'm privileged to represent. When we realized the degree to which so many things that we were dependent on came from China, whether it was pharmaceuticals, whether it was PPP equipment, whether it was critical minerals. A lot of these we knew for many years that we were dependent on, but the pandemic showed our acute vulnerability. We can't produce everything in the United States, but what we can do, and this is another bipartisan area of agreement in the Senate, is we need to encourage our private sector to start removing supply chains that make us so vulnerable. Previously, there was a lot of encouragement to go there. I think the opposite is now the case. And if the private sector doesn't do that, I'm actually confident that the United States Congress will start legislating on that. We cannot be vulnerable from a supply chain perspective to a country that doesn't share our values and takes aggressive actions as it relates to the United States. Can we diversify those supply chains to Korea, to Vietnam, to other countries in Asia and bring some of them back? Yes. But the pandemic was a real watershed moment, and the vulnerability that the average American recognized we have as it relates to China is something that the Congress is very focused on. And I think the private sector and our financial institutions in particular need to be ready for it, because that's going to continue to decouple key strategic sectors from China, and I'm fully for that.
Thank you, Dan. Now I'm going to moderate a panel with Jeff Bader, Wendy Cutler, Pasquale Lamy, Kevin Rudd, and Bob Zellick. We'll begin with the outlook for trade in the U.S., Asia, and Europe, focusing on challenges and the trajectory of trade. Then we'll turn to a discussion which focuses on the path forward, what we need to do to have a positive, forward-looking trade agenda, like the one Chris Coons and Dan Sullivan have outlined. So let's get started. Bob Zellick. Bob, what do you see as the major issues and most likely trajectory for global trade, and how is this impacted by the Russian invasion?
Well, first, Hank, thanks for the invitation and for organizing this robust group. And I very much appreciate the leadership the two senators are showing on this issue in a bipartisan fashion. To answer your question, let me touch briefly on three topics. One, the pre-COVID trends in trade, then COVID effects, and then the effects of war. So first, even before COVID, it's important to keep in mind trade's always a dynamic system. And we saw a slowdown in growth of manufacturing trade since about 2008 and the global financial crisis, which you know well. Although, importantly, the services trade, although far smaller, was growing about 50 to 60% faster. We also seen shifts in regional patterns and concentration, especially in East Asia. And globally, there's been less labor arbitrage through supply chains. So there's more reliance on digital platforms and knowledge workers. You've seen technology shifts, including through the effect of 3D printing, internet fragmentation, but on top of this all, there's been a breakdown in the global governance, as Senator Coons mentioned, with the rules and standards to try to guide this. Second, in general, COVID accelerated these trends. You saw some recovery in cross-border trade in goods, in part because increased consumption of goods. Enterprises stressed resilience, greater awareness of their supply chains, more flexible sourcing. Although if you parse the data, you see that it hasn't quite caught up with some of the statements of some of the executives. Obviously, a bigger move towards digital services, medicine, education, entertainment, business services, finance. And as Pascal Lamy, who will be on with us shortly, suggested, I think you have to expect more precautionary regulation for health and safety standards or border controls, more limits on visas and movements of people, more investment screening, increased state subsidies and regulation, and as the senators mentioned, important U.S.-China decoupling, whether on tech and data and to a degree finance. Third, the strains of war. Obviously, heavily affects on the grain trade, especially wheat, because the two countries affect about 1/4 of the world's supply, and there are already low stocks and rising prices before that. This will hit some of the poorer countries particularly hard, and you have to watch the wave effects in terms of other economic aspects. Energy supplies, same factor. I think over time, we're also going to see greater effects on transport and logistics. Air freight with Russia is severed, longer air routes, railroad connections with Eurasia will be important for some parties in niche markets, and of course, the Black Sea trade. But the point I'll close with, Hank, is I think the most important thing for the future is because of these conditions, we're seeing increased calls for fortress economies. So the idea, whether it's in China or the US or the EU, of self-sufficiency, national controls over the value chain. Now, for the US, this is ironic because the power of our sanctions, whether financial or central bank actions or technology, have been effective because the US is the keystone of a broad system of an international coalition. So to make the sanctions work, you need to have international partners and allies. Of course, less interconnectedness will lead to lower productivity and growth, smaller markets, less competition, and waste, subsidies, corruption. Protected industries will obviously like it. Now, you need to develop resilience and buffers and cushions with international system, particularly to deal with higher costs and choke points. But I foresee a very big political battle ahead, Hank. And if you want to get a good example of it, if you look at Ambassador Tai's recent statement before the congressional committees, she's basically suggesting that the U.S. should achieve security through retreat back home for a protected market, as opposed to trying to strengthen the leverage that we have that, frankly, has been effective with the sanctions and with our economic growth.
Bob, thank you very much for that summary. And Kevin, Rudd, do you have some things to add to that?
I'll focus my comments primarily on China, if that's okay, Hank and Bob. It's great to hear the two senators joining hands on, frankly, what is in substance as critical an issue for America's future and for the future of the free world, as is our recent and continued debates about military security and national security narrowly defined. On the China question, I think what we need to focus on is the following. If we end up with an economic iron curtain, as you starkly pointed to, Hank, at the beginning of our conversation today, we need to be very mindful of where that trajectory takes us. There's a lot of theorization at the moment about Cold War 2.0. An economic iron curtain delivers us Cold War 2.0. It would move from theory to fact. The second point is this, and therefore what would happen as a consequence? Well, the huge driving force of China's economic modernization and growth over the last 35 to 40 years has been one of the principal drivers of global economic growth over the last 35 to 40 years. And it's had two effects as well. One, it has helped to drive down consumer prices for a whole bunch of working families right across the world. And two, because of the addition to global growth, it has increased, in addition, the average incomes of families across the world as well. We all know the downsides of the China trade. We're acutely conscious of industrial policy. We're acutely conscious of trade subsidies. We're acutely conscious of market distortionary practices. But my overall argument is we need to go into this entire debate with eyes wide open, rather than at least 1.5 eyes firmly shut as we head in that particular direction. The final point I'd add to our conversation relating to China, Hank, is this. In the United States, a country which I know and love and I've lived in for the last 5 of the last 7 years, I've lived earlier in China for 3 years of my professional life. What I do notice is this fundamental ground shift within the United States, particularly at the congressional level, but at the community level to some extent as well. It's not what I'd crudely describe as anti-China sentiment, because China under Xi Jinping has pursued a singularly assertive policy, which has rubbed up against countries right across the world, including the United States of America. What I've noticed in this country is the rise of protectionism. And as Senator Coons said eloquently before, being a coherent voice for free trade in the United States body politic at the moment is a bit like a voice sounding in the wilderness in the tradition of John the Baptist. And we know what happened with John the Baptist, didn't end well. So I'm also from the centre left in global politics. I used to be leader of the Australian Labor Party, an Australian Labor Prime Minister, and am an unapologetic free trader. But here is the point. If the United States remains domestically protectionist and sees an opportunity just here and there to, shall I say, soften the edges of that, as opposed to delivering mainstream free trade leadership to the world, including the democratic world, then I believe ultimately the strategic race with China that the United States is currently engaged in will be lost. Related to that, we should not simply take China's application to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership lightly. China understands that its leverage in Asia and the world lies through expanding its economic and trade and ultimately investment and capital markets footprint. That's its strategy. The United States has turned its back on the TPP. It's killed the European or transatlantic equivalent TTIP before it even got going as a substantive negotiation. My request as a 100-year-long friend and ally of the United States, former Prime Minister of Australia, now head of an American think tank, is this requires the most fundamental political rethinking in the United States. That unless you regain the leadership of this, over time, China's pressure and legitimate interests in pursuing a Trans-Pacific Partnership may achieve more regional support in Asia than currently American strategic thinkers in Washington may think. Back to you, Hank.
So, Kevin, thank you for that. And we're now going to go to another panelist, to Wendy Cutler. And Wendy, U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai has stated that she wants a worker-centric trade policy. And in his State of the Union message, President Biden repeatedly emphasized the move to Buy American. Is this administration looking at trade as a tool to close and protect markets or to open them? And how does this starting point impact our ability to negotiate with other countries? And how does Ukraine change it?
Well, you're correct. I mean, Ambassador Tai and the Biden administration more broadly, they're rethinking our trade policy, and they've concluded that the policy of opening markets with the U.S. in playing a leadership role is not in our interest anymore. And frankly, when we look at trade policy, we should look at it through the lens of what helps the middle class and what helps workers. And as a result, they have put forward what I would view as a pretty modest trade policy. They have consulted widely with labor and NGOs, but they've had a bit of a challenge translating these themes into practical trade policy that doesn't result in protectionism. The one exception, and the one I think we'll be discussing later, I think is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which will be really, I think, a major initiative by the administration to kind of sell this new framework for international trade and economic engagement to an important region of the world, the Indo-Pacific. But the question is, will the other countries be interested? Kevin already mentioned the activity of China on this front, applying to join the CPTPP, in the irony of all ironies. And let's keep in mind, RCEP has come into effect among 11 Asian members, And 4 economies are lined up to join the CPTPP. In pursuing the IPEF, the United States has said, we want to put forward some important and pressing issues in the region, but we don't want to offer market access. And that is already of concern to a number of our trading partners who are scratching their heads and wondering what's in it for them.
So, Wendy, thank you for that. Although it's a rather sobering view, I think it's a unfortunately an inaccurate view. So, Jeff Bader, what do you have to add to this as you look at the way trade policy is evolving in the United States?
Well, I think Wendy has summed it up very well. Catherine Tai, in her testimony last week, said that the current version of globalization has not taken us to a secure place. The traditional trade tools are not sufficient. I can't remember since President McKinley, a president who has not talked about the importance of market access for American business and for American workers. This is really unprecedented in the 20th and 21st century. She's not proposing any FTAs. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework barely touches on trade, or certainly doesn't touch on market access. It talks about clean energy, infrastructure, supply chain resilience, worker standards, trade facilitation, and digital standards. I think among those, the digital standards is the only one that really has much of a chance of catching fire in Asia. The rest of it is, as Wendy indicated, not going to be terribly attractive to Asian Pacific countries that are interested in market access. If you're not offering market access, what are you offering to countries? You're not addressing their immediate needs. So if you can't negotiate a market opening, you're just basically closing markets. And that, I fear, is the direction that we're heading at the moment.
So let's, again, that's a sobering view, and it's basically why we decided to put this together, because we obviously are going to need some kind of positive trade agenda looking forward. But let's, Kevin, I'm going to go back to you. So you talked about China from the U.S. perspective, right? Now let's talk about the Chinese perspective. You spent a lot of time studying China, time in China. You know the situation well. It's a political year for Xi Jinping, and clearly he was hoping for economic stability. China has been using its economic might as a diplomatic tool, but also, as you well know, as a way to punish countries like Australia, where it has disagreements. How is China looking at its ability to be a leader on trade today? And what should we make of China's bid to join this CPTPP? You touched on that before, but how has this changed now as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Well, you're right to raise this question, Hank, in terms of how the Chinese view reality and economic reality and geopolitical reality. And as Jeff, as I've seen from the stuff that he's written on this someone who takes the analysis of China domestically as seriously as I do. China right now is a divided house on these questions. Xi Jinping is very much a man of, shall I say, geopolitics and of ideology and of politics. And particularly in the Chinese equivalent of election year, which is 2022, the 20th Party Congress, which by November will determine whether or not Xi Jinping becomes leader for life. So in looking at these realities, what I have seen is sort of two sets of conclusions from the Xi Jinping side of the shop. One, partly in reaction to the US-China trade war, we have seen a new move in China towards the doctrine of national economic self-sufficiency, 自力更生. It's a phrase which was largely confined to earlier discourse about the Chinese Cultural Revolution, but now it's been rehabilitated by Xi Jinping, and there's an active discussion not just about it, but about the reinvention of Chinese industrial policy, not just China 2025, but other arms of that policy as well, and a rehabilitation as well of, shall we say, state-owned enterprises as being the principal agent of this new industrial policy. Personally, I'm skeptical as to whether it will work, but that's in fact part of the direction in which he seeks to go. I think the second element, however, in Xi Jinping's approach to trade policy is that if you read carefully the ideological documents, he sees trade and market access to China within the constraints of what I've just described as national economic self-sufficiency. He sees trade access and investment access as part of the, to use his own term, gravitational pull globally of the Chinese economy to bring more and more firms within, shall we say, the geopolitical orbit of the Chinese system. Now, that's very much how he sees it. And therefore, the underpinning nature of the Chinese economic structure, as he would see it, is unlikely to change, and industrial policy is likely to become stronger rather than weaker. So, Brent, cutting to the chase, where does that leave us vis-a-vis the substantive prospects of success with a Trans-Pacific Partnership CPTPP application? It may be that the geopolitics of it, Hank, is to divide American allies in Asia in terms of do you vote for or against Chinese accession to the TPP. If you were to succeed, then you add to Xi Jinping's strategic vision of, as it were, bringing countries closer into China's gravitational orbit. But on the bottom line question, would the Chinese system under Xi Jinping dismantle the industrial policies and trade protectionist policies and subsidy policies now in place and becoming stronger in order to meet the requirements of CTPP membership? I'm not so sure. So, as I said, it's a house divided, and currently those favoring the party, shall I say, industrial, older form of economic management appear to be prevailing over the liberal reformers, which many of us around this particular gathering and seminar today are familiar with. Back to you, Hank.
So, Kevin or anybody else want to comment on how the war in Ukraine may have changed, China's view on using trade as a tool? And I'm going to go to Pasquale first because, I think the European perspective is very, very important here.
Thanks, Hank, and hello to colleagues. Let me make a few points following what has been said already on the big picture before we move to what should we do next. First, I agree with Bob Zoellick that the trade patterns of the last decade has changed under the influence of a series of modification in shaping factors. First, the balance between geoeconomics and geopolitics, and we are clearly in a situation, and sanctions are here to tell this to us, where in some cases geopolitics trump geoeconomics without any pan on words. Second, what has changed is technology, with this huge drive to digital, which is a major booster of international trade. And the third big shaping factor is what I call collective preferences, and hence this drive to precaution on better care for environment, for health, and to some extent for national security, which takes us back to the geopolitical sanctions. Overall, we should be careful to look at the right numbers. Data which measure trade in volumes are not the ones that we should consider. What we should look at is data which measure trade in value addition. And if you look at this in value addition, you will see that the growing part of international trade, which is services, is increasing global trade. Number two, on sanctions, let me try and bring two distinctions. We talk about trade sanctions, about economic coercion. Yes, we have quite a bit of that, and we've had quite a bit of that for some time. But I think we have to make a difference in sanctions, whether they are unilateral or pluri or multilateral, with or without UN cover. And this makes a big difference. If China puts pressure on Australia unilaterally, this is something. If a coalition puts pressure on Russia plurilaterally, it's a different thing. And we should not assimilate these two things. Second, I think there's also a difference in sanctions, whether you sanction Russia or Iran on the one side, or whether you sanction China or, let's say, India on the other side. The trade of Russia or of Iran is medieval trade. It's raw material, it's agriculture. It's not what we call sophisticated 21st century trade. It's areas where you produce something, you have too much of that, you have to sell it, and the others, because they don't have enough of that, have to buy it. And I think there has to be a difference in the way we gauge the impact of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in the international system. I'm not sure it's a real change of paradigm. Third, and before last, comment on what others have said. I'm not, to be frank, a big fan of decoupling. And the reason why I'm not a big fan of decoupling is precisely because if we want to keep exerting influence on other countries or groups of countries, we are in a better shape. When I say we, which is the economies that are the most developed, the most sophisticated, the more complex, we are in a better position to do this with a globalized economy rather than with countries that have gone the way to decoupling. And this is the case for China. I think whatever danger China represents, and I do agree that there are Chinese dangers, a self-sufficient China, an autarkic China is more dangerous than a globalized China. And this is my last point on what Kevin said. I think he's absolutely right. There are two trends in the Chinese system, what he calls a divided house, and I think that's absolutely right. The ones that want to bank on more self-sufficiency at the cost of the efficiency of the Chinese economy and its growth. And there is a direct link between more self-sufficiency and less efficiency productivity. No doubt about that in my mind. And on the other side are the ones that say China still needs a wide respiration with the rest of the world to grow its economy. And I think where we are around this virtual table, we probably would have a better game trying to keep China globalized as much as we can in influencing the right forces in China rather than the other way around. Over to you, Hank.
So, Pasquale, thank you very much for that. And now we're going to go to Jeff Bader. And Jeff, the Trump Phase 1 trade deal was a throwback to the old days of, the Chinese trade mission, buying missions, and Trump imposed tariffs are still in place. Even still, China has not fulfilled its obligations. What does this, coupled with Ukraine, mean for our future economic relationship with China? Do Western sanctions and U.S. companies' rapid exits from the Russian markets suggest that decoupling with China could go much further than we all thought just a few months ago? And if the U.S. decouples to a greater extent than the rest of the world, how will this impact our economic competitiveness?
Oh, well, Hank, even before Ukraine, the U.S. and China were locked into a competitive, if not adversarial, posture towards each other. The foreign policy elites and military strategists on both sides have been making long-term plans, as has the U.S. Congress, based on assumptions of hostility. And these assumptions are mutually reinforcing, and they help perceptions become reality. Now, the Phase 1 deal was largely about U.S. commodity exports. You might think of it as sort of soybeans plus. It was a form of managed trade. It It was not sensitive to market needs, which depend on the specific requirements of buyers and sellers. So it's not surprising that it achieved less than 60% of its commitments. But countries aren't traders, companies are. So it's a massively inefficient way of doing business. Parenthetically, I just say that it was rather sad that Vice Premier Liu He had to insist on inserting reference to market disciplines in WTO into the agreement. One would have thought that the US would have been inserting those normally. Anyway, it's proven to be not a sustainable model, either in theory or in practice. And the administration, according to what Catherine Tai said to the Ways and Means and Finance Committee last week, has agreed that it doesn't work and there won't be a phase 2 agreement along those lines. Now, both US political parties seem to believe that the next election will be decided by protection-oriented voters in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. As long as that is the calculation, there aren't going to be trade expanding policies. Normally, the APEC meeting each fall provides an opportunity for Asian leaders to get together with the President of the United States and persuade them of the importance of trade for US foreign policy. I don't think that this year will provide such an opportunity with 2024, the current calculations about 2024 and the importance of the Midwest looming. Now, a degree of decoupling between the US and China is already a fact of life. We have tariffs of 15, 20, 25% across the board on Chinese exports to the US. We have ever expanding entities lists by different agencies. We have bans on investing in military connected companies. Decoupling could go further if legislation to review outbound investment passes. There is such a provision in, I think, the House version of the Competes Act. And if the Competes Act and the US ICA Act, the US International Competitive Act, are merged and passed in some form, there are many elements in that have to do with China, which doubtless will draw a Chinese reaction. Looming over that all, if the US political class concludes that Xi Jinping was a co-conspirator with Putin in unleashing the war in Ukraine based on their February 4th meeting and their relationship without limits that they announced, decoupling could go quite a bit further. I think so far the administration has been careful not to draw that conclusion. I think they've been trying to offer the Chinese a way out. I don't think any of us know what actually happened in that meeting. Personally, I think it's highly unlikely that Putin laid out to Xi Jinping in detail what he had in mind. But if, for example, products with semiconductors are sanctioned, it could capture a large class of goods going to China. Financial services companies may find themselves further restricted on what they can do in China. I can imagine the administration or Congress coming up with broad-based, loosely defined retaliatory strategies that punish a range of Chinese companies for real or imagined sanctions busting. But there are two serious constraints on how far decoupling can go, happily. One is the potential impact on the US economy, which should make the US government cautious. Many of our major companies have hundreds of Chinese components or inputs in the supply chain. These cannot be easily replaced or replaced cheaply. In general, Chinese companies will comply with sanctions. The Chinese government will complain about them and denounce them the whole time, but they will comply. The companies will comply. And secondly, just if I can intrude a little bit into Pascal's turf for a second, I think it's highly unlikely that the Europeans and the Japanese will go down the road of sanctioning China after having sanctioned Russia. The Europeans are angry, understandably, at China for its alignment with Russia on Ukraine, but they're not going to buy into the notion of taking on two adversaries at once, particularly given the magnitude of their dependence on trade with China, especially by the Germans, unless China moves to provide arms to Russia.
So, Jeff, thank you for that summary. Wendy, over to you. Your comments on this question or things you might add to what Jeff has said.
So first, I mean, I totally agree with Jeff that the Phase 1 agreement was largely a failure. However, I would point out that the Trump administration did try to address some structural issues, but even with all of the tariffs they put in place, they could only make incremental progress in areas like tech transfer and IPR. So it leads me to conclude that the idea we're going to sit down with China and negotiate on trade distorting subsidies, on the behavior of state-owned enterprises, and these other big issues, the prospects are slim. I don't see that happening. Maybe there's some discrete issues we could negotiate with China, but even that seems like a stretch now. So where does that leave us? I think we need to work with our allies and partners in addressing the China challenge, and that's exactly what the Biden administration is focusing on. And here, there are kind of two strands of work. One is the defensive, punitive side, where we work with our allies and partners. We look at our existing tools. We discuss what new tools are needed, and we coordinate with respect to actions we take against China's trade distorting subsidies and other unfair trade practices, whether that be in areas of investment screening, export controls, or other areas. But second, I think we also need to have a rule-making component, working with like-minded countries to kind of set the standards we want to see in place. And as Senator Coons said at the outset, digital is kind of a key area here. And I would hope that's an area that we urgently move forward on. My concern is the way digital is being treated in the Indo-Pacific economic framework. It will be part of this broader trade pillar. It won't be a standalone initiative. And as a result, we may find that some of the countries we very much want to encourage to join us on our digital standards and norms won't be interested because they will be asked to do things in areas that they have no interest in moving on, including labor standards. I would just conclude just one point on the Ukraine. I think, one point you mentioned, Hank, and I couldn't agree with more, that, in terms of sanctions, what seemed unimaginable just 4, 6, 8 weeks ago are now, being discussed, including, removing MFN, not just from Russia, but some folks now are talking about removing it from China. So I'm sure Beijing is looking at these sanctions very carefully, kind of surprised and also concerned about the speed and their scope and their severity. And probably this is going to accelerate their interest in achieving self-sufficiency and therefore not being subject to, the punitive actions by the West. So I think this is a direction that is just going to complicate things going forward.
It's going to complicate a lot of things going forward. And Wendy, thank you to that. And now, Pasquale, I'm going to go back to you. And you've addressed some of this earlier, but Europeans have traditionally been much less willing to use trade as a punitive tool. And do you see a changing perspective in Europe? How do you see that changing? And let me also ask if you see a rise in trading blocks and regional agreements versus the previous push for global trading rules. And how does that play out, especially related to the US and China?
Thanks, Hank. On the first point, you're absolutely right. Trade sanctions, economic and trade coercion is not part of the EU DNA. And the simple reason for that, the European Union started as a common market. So there is a sort of ideological big preference for open trade rather than for obstructing trade. And the EU has practiced trade sanctions very exceptionally, usually within a big coalition or with the UN mandate. That was the case for apartheid in South Africa in the 60s. It was the case with Iran. although EU sanctions were not always in sync with US sanctions. So that's the past. What is true is that the EU has kept this reluctance to trade sanctions, and what we do in the case of Russia is an obvious exception given the obvious atrocities and breaches of international law that Putin is practicing with what he does in Ukraine. So this is, in my view, a sort on the side of exceptions. Yet the EU has learned that economic coercion exists, and that EU can be a victim of economic coercion. We've been victims of US sanctions from time to time, and notably the indirect impact of US sanctions towards China, which hit EU-China trade or investment in some cases, as it does, by the way, for Japan or for Korea. And we've also seen China practicing economic and trade coercion on Australia or on Lithuania, which happens to be a European country. So as a reaction to that, the EU has put together a sort of new trade arsenal, which is called the anti-coercion instrument. So to put it simply, the EU remains anti-coercion, but is equipping itself to be able not to be coerced in case. On your second question, Hank, I'm, and I've always been less sanguine than others in opposing multilateral to regional agreements or even bilateral agreements. My own view, for what it's worth, is that I practice, and Kevin will like this, the Chinese proverb, which is that the cat doesn't mind the color of the mice. So provided it's a mice, you catch it. And if you catch obstacle to trade with regional or bilateral trade agreements, that's fine. And if you catch them with multilateral agreement, that's fine. So, and the reality, if you look at numbers, is that what we've seen for the last decades is a cohabitation, a coexistence, and to some extent a convergence between multilateral trade rules and plurilateral, regional, or bilateral trade rules. I think yet this is changing a bit, and I see for the moment more space for opening trade with a proper regulatory framework in what I call plurilateral agreements, which I think is probably the way to go in the future, given the pressure of geopolitics on geoeconomic trade opening. But this is complex. The areas where we now need to open trade, and I think Senator Coons put it extremely well in saying that today's game of opening trade is more about setting standards than setting tariffs. And I think this is fundamentally right. And this is something which many have not yet understood, that the way you open trade today is in aligning or making standards compatible or mutually recognized. This is the way forward, while recognizing that it's more complex to harmonize, to make standards compatible than just to lower tariffs or subsidies. But I think this is the way to go, and notably in the areas which the Senator and others have mentioned, which is digital and the nexus between trade and environment, which is how to make trade opening and trade flows more environmental friendly. Over to you, Henry.
So, Pasquale, thank you very much to that. And now I'm going to go to Bob Zoellick. Bob spent a lot of time in Europe thinking about Europe. So, Bob, any comments, additions to what Pasquale said, or anything else that's been said on this first part of our discussion before we shift toward thinking about what we can do on a proactive basis.
Well, Hank, let me start. Jeff Bader worked in a subtle slur of President McKinley, and I want to draw that out for both a good and a bad part. So for people who don't know, President McKinley was elected in 1896. He was assassinated in 1901, putting Teddy Roosevelt in the White House. And as Jeff properly points out, when McKinley was a congressman, he was chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, powerful trade committee, and he was a protectionist. He was from the state of Ohio. However, when he became president and saw the broader national interest, particularly the United States as a rising power, he actually moved to support what was called trade reciprocity, particularly with Latin America. Now, the bad news is he was assassinated at the Columbian Exposition after giving a speech talking about trade reciprocity and openness having changed from his protectionist position. So people may draw different historical conclusions about that. But on the regionalization, I think just to pick up on what Pascal said, regionalization has been occurring for a long time. This is what the European Union is about. We see this in North America. I think what we tried to draw out in this call is I'm not sure people in the US realize the degree it's happened in East Asia. And whether it's autos or electronics or computers, it was, Kevin mentioned sort of the use of economic gravity, but this is actually a trade term, economic geography and gravity. And there's a reality, if you look at the distances, that these markets are going to interact with each other. Now, this isn't all such a bad thing. There's some good reasons. Supply and logistics chains, I mean, the story of the European Union, as Pascal mentioned, but also if you're going to cooperate on cross-border issues such as environment, health, infrastructure, migration, of course you're going to have regional integration. So I think the challenge is how do you connect regional integration with global networks? Because you still have global networks on finance, energy, food, communications, biological security, climate, innovation. And so I think we have to expect that there will be economic power and attractive poles, but yet avoid it moving into blocks. And the danger of the decoupling logic and the protectionism is that you start to slip into the logic of blocks. And we saw that before. That is what happened in the 1930s. So I think in the near term, the greatest challenge for the US is maintaining interconnections with East Asia because of these big changes in East Asia. And as Kevin alluded to, the idea that all the other friendly economies, allies, some democracies, some not, are going to line up with us against China is foolhardy. Japan, South Korea, even Australia, they're not going to cut off from China. So you need to have a different approach that recognizes the dangers, but also tries to see some of the opportunities. But I wouldn't stop there. I mean, part of the story of the sanctions has been the strength of the transatlantic relationship. You want to build on that, and it's very economically important. But also, as Senator Coons was talking about, if you think about support in the Congress, there have been efforts to the U.S. to expand trade with sub-Saharan Africa. There was something called AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, gave preferences. We should consider, again, how to draw the Africans, who are trying to come up with their own free trade area, by the way, to try to figure out how we can support them, or again, build on relationships with Latin America. So again, to wrap this together, there was a movement in some of US policy thinking about saying, well, we need now just to pivot to China in East Asia. And whether it's the Middle East or Europe, that's going to get less attention. I think that theory has a lot less weight after you've seen what happened in Ukraine or what you watch going on in the Middle East. And so the reality is the United States is a global power, and its strength is its reaching across regions and topics, military, economic, and political. And the sad story is we're basically dropping out the economic aspect of that network. We still have the military power. We've got various political organizing power, but I think all of us in different ways are saying, if we ignore the economic part and try to have this come home America for fortress economics, we're going to be weaker and be less influential in the world and poorer.
So, Bob, well said. And so now let's shift our discussion to focus on what might be done. what might have some chance of being done to establish a positive, forward-looking trading agenda. And Wendy, I'm going to start with you. And you've already discussed, touched on Biden's Indo-Pacific Economic Partnership, and you've indicated that there's not a lot in that to be attractive to our Asian allies if we're not going to open markets. But so the question to you is, how important is this to the Biden administration, and do you think that importance may change as a result of what's happening in Ukraine? And what can the Biden administration do to make that a more robust agreement? Or to comment on to what extent does the U.S. need a proactive, positive trade agenda to remain economically competitive, to set standards, as everyone has emphasized, and project economic leadership abroad? So you spend a lot of time in Washington focusing on these issues. So what are your best ideas here?
So just to be clear, I mean, I do think that there is a lot of potential in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. We don't know the details yet, but we do know that many of the topics that the Biden administration is putting on the table, including infrastructure, decarbonization, resilient supply chains, digital trade, these are key issues and issues of interest in the region. When I look at the region, though, I think I kind of, they're kind of two sets of partners, right? We have our really close allies and partners, the Australias, the Japans, the New Zealands, the Koreas, the Singapores, who want us back in the region economically. And so when it comes to the IPEF, they're working with us closely to help shape this initiative. And I think they're going to be less judgmental about it because they very much see this as a positive, affirmative economic agenda for the Biden administration and recognize the political constraints. But in order for this initiative to be successful as a regional initiative, we need to bring in more than these kind of usual suspects, right? We need to go beyond the Singapores when we look at the ASEAN countries, whether it be Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Vietnam. Those are the countries that traditionally really seek market access from us. And as a result, in the trade-off, they're then willing to do things that they kind of don't want to do, like strengthen labor standards, do more on IPR, et cetera. And so the Biden administration is going to need to find other incentives and carrots for these countries to bring them on board. And they are looking at that, including infrastructure financing, like some private-public partnerships, capacity building. But the question will be, are those incentives sufficient to bring kind of the second group of countries on? So those are a couple of the challenges that the administration is facing in putting together this initiative. But also, another challenge they have is that some of our partners in the regions are still feeling the scars from our TPP exit. So some of them are asking themselves, wait a second, we're now being asked to make strong commitments in certain areas we don't want to in return for, some potential benefits. But there's no assurance with the next president that indeed these commitments will stand firm. And so I would really hope that Congress, in a bipartisan way, would somehow endorse this initiative and put the strength of Congress behind this initiative. Because as Bob said, we're there in terms of security or political ties. We're doing well in the region right now. But if we don't have an economic component to our engagement, we get an incomplete.
Yeah, we get an incomplete and we leave the playing field to China, right? So, Bob, what kind of U.S. trade agenda do you think is doable and politically doable? And how have recent events impacted it?
So, I think this exchange has been useful in trying to draw attention to the fact that a trade agenda has to have three elements. You have to be able to make a case for the economic benefits for the United States. the administration talks about workers. I sometimes want to know, is it workers or jobs? Is it which workers? Is it export workers? Is it farmers and ranchers or exporters? Is it energy? Is it technology? They're a little fuzzy on that for, I think, the political reasons that Jeff mentioned. But you have to make the economic argument. Second, the importance of this to our larger international partnerships, whether you want to call it foreign policy, security policy, America's role in the world, but that's another element. And third, and vitally important, the congressional and domestic support. That's why I told a little story about President McKinley, and this has been part of the American experience for anybody sort of dealing with trade. So I would urge an idea of ambition, but also a pragmatism. You try to get done what you can, and in the sense the senators might have a better sense of this. By the way, one word that we haven't raised in this conversation, which you're well aware of, is inflation. You know, at some point, you raise all the costs for these products, for steel and others, and aluminum and others, and, you know, what I hear pollsters and, in fact, Democratic politicians saying is the number one issue for voters is inflation. Why would you have a trade policy that increases inflation? So, in practical terms, I think, you know, to build on what Wendy said, I think there's both a need because of the market and an opportunity in the digital area. And one can do this in a more modular fashion. The United States has had elements of this with other types of agreements. And there'll be some countries, you know, in the ASEAN and other or Latin America that might be willing to take parts, but not all. And this involves topics like data transfers, not having having ability to have technology choice, non-discrimination policies, which you choose, and not having authoritarian controls. And there's a political opportunity here because if you listen to a lot of the points I'm making on this, it really is about open economies and open political systems. So it should fit with part of the administration's agenda. Now, the practical reality is countries are going to have different policies about privacy, antitrust, security. The European Union, as Pascal knows, has been a leader on some of these topics. You have to be able to permit this transfer while allowing different countries to have different approaches with some of those issues. And it can't make the perfect the enemy of the good in this area. Another one that I think is worth exploring, this is probably a minority view, but I've had actually some members in both the House and the Senate say this, is that given the Chinese, the hostility towards China, can we make lemonade out of the lemons? Could you revive the idea of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, recognizing it's a way of having partnerships with other economies, and use that as a basis for going back in? So this would be kind of using the foreign as well as the economic policy sort of interests. And Kevin Rudd touched on this a little bit in his comment. Senator Coons also touched a little bit on the USMCA, which was the rewrite of NAFTA. And this has a couple of elements. One, the implementation of this will be very important. There's some labor standards that could be used to strengthen Mexican unions. That would be a plus, or they could be used to have American unions block Mexican goods, which would be a big minus, particularly if you're thinking about our strength of our region versus China. You might also, if you got both Democratic and Republican votes for the USMCA, why not apply it to a country like the United Kingdom that left the EU? If the big benefit of USMCA was higher labor standards, it's a little hard for me to believe that American labor unions can't trust the labor standards in Britain. So that's another where you could take initiative. Or even a small one. You mentioned, Hank, you know, how President Biden mentioned Buy America, I don't know, 5 or 6 times in his State of the Union. Could he add North America? Could we at least have Canada and Mexico be part of that system? Which, by the way, if you want to draw some of the production away from China, the Mexican economy would be similar. You could try to, in terms of wages and others, wouldn't that be a mutual benefit? And every dollar that boosts the Mexican economy comes back to the U.S. economy because Mexicans buy from the U.S. more generally. We haven't talked about the WTO, and we need the World Trade Organization, and we need to at least touch on that because the Trump administration blocked the appointment of people to the appellate body in the dispute settlement system, which, by the way, the U.S. fought very hard in the Reagan and Bush administrations and Clinton to sort of get, because we thought if fair rules and fair processes, Americans can compete. But this wasn't Trump's view. He wanted to believe that you could sort of avoid having the dispute settlement system and just use his great negotiating power. And by the way, Catherine Tai, in an audience I spoke to or was listening to, made the same point. She wasn't so big on fixing the arbitration system, which probably explains why people in the WTO who want to work with us have said, what does the U.S. want? It's a little hard to negotiate if you haven't said what the U.S. wants. Now, I could imagine you could have some combination of some fixes about processes or something that some of the people on this call will know called safeguards to protect various industries for certain times. And frankly, you probably need something, given the state-owned enterprises in China, to be able to treat them in some sort of different category. But in my experience, and I'm sure your Hank's, it's a little hard to negotiate with somebody if you don't have an ask. And then the next question would be, as a number of people have mentioned, it's not enough to have that system. You need to have a system of rules. Catherine Tai spoke to an audience, again, I was at, of Nordic business leaders, and she made a point. She said, well, there haven't been new rules in the WTO since the mid-90s when the WTO came into being. And she said, I was in high school. And she said, it's a terrible failing. But then she didn't seem to assume that the U.S. had any responsibility to try to negotiate additional rules. And I kind of thought that was what her job description was supposed to be. So whether it's fishery subsidies or health supplies or other topics, the United States needs to have a global agenda that supplements the regional and the bilateral agenda. And then one last part here is with China. Wendy kind of touched on this. You know, if you read Catherine Tai's statements, she says negotiations failed, discussions failed, in a sense, the Trump administration failed. But then she kind of doesn't say, well, what's she going to do? And this most recent statement to Congress got me scared because she said, well, we have to move beyond tariffs. Well, geez, you know, the United States was kind of one of the leaders after the 30s who at least have barriers with tariff numbers so you can negotiate them down. I don't know what she has in mind to kind of block things off. But this is where I'll differ a little bit with Wendy. I don't think it's a surprise that the Chinese have resisted the Trump administration's demands, given the way the Trump administration raised tariffs, tried to humiliate people, sort of assumed that other people have to dance to their tune. You know, as you know, Wendy, as a negotiator, sometimes if you try to find some mutual interests, for example, in intellectual property rights protection, the Chinese have built courts that are finding more for Westerners, but the penalties aren't high. And with forced technology transfer, which is prohibited, a big problem for companies, but they're afraid to bring cases because they're afraid of retaliation. Well, what if we tried to reduce some of the joint venture requirements? So I could imagine you could have an agenda where you could reduce some barriers on both sides and add to market access while recognizing it's a different system and you're going to have to work with that system in a different way. But this comes back to Kevin Rudd's sort of comment. We're fooling ourselves if we think that Europe and the rest of the Pacific or even India is going to ignore the Chinese economy and try to contain it. It just won't work.
So, Bob, okay, thank you for that. And now I'm going to go to Jeff and get some comments on China, because a number of major U.S. companies, as you know, do a lot of business in China, which also is a very important part of many of their global supply chains. And there's still, even after all the decoupling that's going on, a large amount of trade between our two countries. So is there a path forward to fix what looks like a broken and rapidly deteriorating economic relationship with China? And how does trade fit into this? In other words, from the U.S. perspective, what is the best reasonable case? And what will it take to make that possible?
Well, trade can serve as a bond between countries and soften the hostile trends that we've been describing between U.S. and China. Anything with high technology, which is pretty much all products nowadays, is going to raise issues. We need, that of course is the area of America's main competitive advantage, is in the high technology area. The general slogan seems to be that we need high walls and narrow yards to protect key technology platforms. I think that most of us can agree on that, but we need a serious process to define what those high walls and those small gardens are going to look like. Ukraine. Ukraine has been touched on inevitably many times in our discussion. is certainly reinforcing trends towards autarky and towards independent supply chains. Catherine Tai talked in her testimony last week about not wanting to rely upon unfriendly countries in supply chains. I think we know who she means. But there are opportunities, and that was the thrust of your question, I think, Hank. What are the opportunities? First, on tariffs. Janet Yellen has said that these tariffs are not in U.S. interests. And Bob Zoellick talked about the impact on inflation in certain defined areas. There's just no reason why we can't look at this in a more serious way. They've taken about 390 out of 530 tariff lines for revisiting in the last few weeks. But they can go much further than that. I think strategically, we need to think much more seriously about the consequences of hostile relationships with the second and third major nuclear powers in the world at the same time. China is not going to transform into a country with a system of our choosing, no matter what pressures we apply. And the framing that the Biden administration uses in talking about China of autocracy versus democracy really does not conform with broad global U.S. interests on things like issues like climate change, non-proliferation, fighting pandemics, or for that matter, dealing with regional hotspots, Iran, North Korea, wherever. It's been obviously enormously useful in marshaling forces in Europe to resist the Ukraine invasion, but that isn't a model that's replicable for most global crises that we're going to be facing in the coming years. The reality, as Bob talked about, is we've got a Sino-centric integrated manufacturing hub that began to take shape 30 years ago and is not diminished. How do you leave China out of supply chains when it's thoroughly embedded in production networks with participants from numerous friendly countries in Northeast and Southeast Asia? I mean, what is the Indo-Pacific economic framework without China, when China is the core of Asian economic integration? The Asians I have spoken to and read about do not want to get caught in a U.S.-China economic confrontation in which they have to choose sides. I'd be interested in Kevin's thoughts on this, since he's been, I think, more exposed to Asian thinking in recent months than the rest of us have. The idea of isolating Russia over a brutal invasion is one thing. Breaking supply chains with China, these countries depend on, is something else entirely. You know, we've seen this movie before with conditional MFN in the 1990s. It did not end well. Even that was a time when we received 30% of China's exports. Now we receive 15%. ASEAN is a bigger recipient of China's exports, as is the EU than the United States is. So our leverage is reduced. Our leverage is not so much trade, frankly, as it is the dollar-denominated global financial system, and that's what's been made the response in Ukraine so effective. But I think finally we need to recognize that we're not the only one with grievances. China feels with some reason that the U.S. is seeking to prevent its rise, its exercise of influence on the international scene. We're demanding that China play by rules that we ignore, and we're challenging its sovereignty. A little touch of humility and strategic empathy might help us make better decisions and improve relationships. The West against Russia may prove a formula for success against a country inadequately integrated into global commerce. It's a much less effective formula against the world's largest trading nation. Ukraine has changed a lot, but Asia is still proceeding largely on the path of emphasis on economic development, with Ukraine a sideshow for most Asians.
Jeff, thank you for that summary. I'm going to go to Kevin now to comment on it. But Kevin, I'd like you also to talk a little bit about technology as it relates to clean energy and climate. Because Jeff had said high technology is a problem, but obviously, we're going to get nowhere near where we need to get in mitigating the impact on climate change if China is not able to make progress. And so, export controls on clean energy. Also, Jeff made the point about the global supply chains and how integrated China was into global supply chains in Asia. And, also I would add in the US, it's important. They're an important part of our supply chains. And, I don't think it would go over big in the United States if US manufacturers had to shut down operations because they couldn't because they're reliant on China for components or key parts of their supply chain. So, Kevin, over to you.
Thanks, Hank, and I value very much what Jeff Bader just contributed to the discussion. Firstly, on climate, renewable energy transformation and technology, and then on to supply chains and a couple of concluding remarks about where to from here. I think even within the current geopolitical parameters of the US-China relationship, the truth is climate collaboration is not just possible, it is actually happening still, despite everything that may be being said, and not just to the policy level, the corporate level, and at the technology level. My overall argument is that this must be encouraged because the climate imperative is not just a bunch of UN feel-good stuff. If you've read the most recent report by the UN scientists, which was just released 48 hours ago, it's in the national interest of the United States and China to act on climate change, because if you don't, it's not just the world that suffers, it's you two guys that suffer as well. So this is a huge, in my view, necessary and realist, in international relations terms, geopolitical carve-out from whatever else is going on of a deleterious nature in the relationship. Secondly, on supply chains, not just in terms of climate-related technologies and renewable energy technologies and other demand-side efficiency technologies. The truth is, if you were to conduct a poll today of US companies currently on the ground in China, and AmCham has just done this in China, 80% of them have not the slightest intention of leaving China because of the proximity to the Chinese domestic market and the integral nature of these operations to global supply chains involving American global corporates. So good luck if you're about to issue them with an administrative fiat to get the hell out of there. I'm not sure how they will respond. In fact, the largest reason which is advanced by American corporates in China at present through the AmCham survey is China's current COVID management regime domestically, which is fundamentally difficult for doing business. And Hank, in our remaining time in this discussion, a few other concluding comments on where we could go to from here, where we should go to from here in terms of moving the dial on global and national free trade policy. Just a couple of quick bullet points. Number one is never forget something old-fashioned called political leadership. Bob Zellick has added to my John the Baptist analogy in terms of people having their heads blown off or taken off for uttering unpopular phrases and prophecies in their age. And free trade feels a bit like that in the current US body politic domestically. But guess what? This is not set in stone, particularly as the inflationary effect of protectionism starts to rear its ugly head across the democracies. And suddenly, the assumptions of the previous 35 years about the price of a shirt and about the price of a pair of shoes starts to fundamentally change. And so this should not be seen as set in stone. And that's at the fundamental level of inflation, cost of living, and living standards. But there's a second and ideational case to be made, which Bob also touched on, and I'm old-fashioned enough to actually believe in these three principles. Open politics, open economies, and open societies equals happier and more prosperous people. This is not a bad cri de coeur. It's not a bad call to arms. You can't have open politics and open societies and forget about open economies. It ultimately is a non sequitur as a matter of logic, political science, and political economy. So I think there's a case to be made, because we are assuming that we're just all up against a Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, protectionist global vortex from which there is no recovery. And this is where political leadership comes in. I think you're right, Bob, when you referred before to leveraging in the current geopolitical realities the United States back into the TPP debate, albeit by different names. And frankly, unless the United States does that, and the Republicans in particular in the Congress and Dems need to understand this, by remaining hostile to the idea of the TPP and by refusing to even embrace the Atlantic equivalent with the Europeans, you are ultimately losing the geostrategic battle against China big time. That's the message for the hawks and the hardliners. Third point is Wendy's excellent comment earlier on about digital trade and the digital commerce regime. And I think an intelligent piece of diplomacy in extricating it from, let's call it the IPEF framework, so that it can be independently prosecuted in negotiations with our friends and partners across Asia in a manner which is mutually advantageous. Fourthly, never forget Mother India. Those of us who are trying to negotiate FTAs with India over the last 10 to 20 years all have enough collective scar tissue to realize that this is not to be entered into lightly. But here's a little indication of a bit of change in Delhi. I launched a free trade agreement between Australia and India a decade ago. And guess what? They just signed an interim FTA with Canberra 2 days ago. So there is, my friends in Delhi tell me, there is something of an opening in Delhi at the moment on the broader question of free trade, driven by their own geopolitics with China. They're looking at an FTA with the UK. They may even embrace one more broadly with the Europeans. Who knows what they might do with Uncle Sam. And finally, can I just agree also with Bob on his, I mean, maybe it was Bob and Pascal, on the question is, let's not forget the WTO. Developing this rules-based system was a difficult piece of work. Reinstituting its arbitral mechanisms is critical by whatever diplomatic and political policy means, because it provides the underpinning firmament for whatever then happens in terms of effective regional free trade agreements. And Pascal's point about Deng's observation, it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, so long as it eats mice. He's right, except the only problem with Xi Jinping at the moment is he might want to kill the cat as well, unless it's a loyal party member. But that goes back to the divided nature of the House within the Chinese economic policy debate. Back to you, Hank.
Okay, so Kevin, thank for that. And we cannot leave this discussion without asking Pasquale about the likelihood of strengthening the WTO. And if it's not strengthened, does it become irrelevant? So Pasquale, and then I'm going to give Wendy the last word if she has anything to say on the WTO or any concluding remarks.
Thanks, Hank. The shorthand answer to your question is yes, the WTO is not working well for the moment, but this does not mean that it is irrelevant. You could probably say exactly the same thing about the UN Security Council. It's not working well, but it is not irrelevant. We need a WTO, and I think this has been said by Bob, by Wendy, by Kevin, for at least two reasons. One, all countries are not trade big shots. Of course, you have the US, you have China, you have the EU. They have a huge domestic market. They can be the bosses on trade issues. But the rest of the world needs trade opening. And if they are only in the weak position of having to deal bilaterally with big shots like US, EU, or China, this does not work. So we need, for reasons that have to do with this multilateral coalition for more open trade, we need something which is different from the bilateral or even the regional agreement. Second, and I think this is a more debatable point, but I'll put it on the table because that's what I believe. We need China to make concessions in the future of trade in one area, which is what the Chinese leaders call competitive neutrality. This coexistence between global market capitalism and a country which has 1/3 of its economy under state and party command cannot work properly unless China accepts more disciplines on, let's say, state aid, to put it simply. This will not happen between US and China, nor will it happen between EU and China. It will happen the day India, South Africa, Brazil, Vietnam will start making the point to the Chinese that competing with state-owned enterprises is a problem. And I think for this reason, this can only happen within a global trade organization. Second point on this, and this has been said, and very clearly again by Senator Coons a moment ago, opening trade in the future is not like opening trade in the past. And this is the distinction I make between protectionism and precautionism. Protectionism is when you protect your producers from foreign competition. Precautionism is when you protect your people from risks. And this will be the case in the future, notably in areas which are the ones we have to care about for the future, which is the digitalization and the nexus between trade and environment. We need a global approach to this because these are global public goods. And this has to do more with standards, regulations, than, of course, tariffs or subsidies. Third, this means a WTO reform in two meanings: a better agenda on the one side, and second, a better way of processing trade negotiations. A better agenda, we know where the main issues are: China competitive neutrality, digital trade, and more friendly international open trade, more friendly to the environment. These are the three big blocks, and I think this is reasonably clear. Of course, there are a few other issues like fishery subsidies or like agricultural subsidies, but those are the three major issues. And I think this is roughly the sort of agenda which we need to have in mind. But there is also, and I know that because, as many of you know, I've been in the machine room of the WTO for 8 years of my life. The machine room needs to be properly reformed, including in giving to the WTO Secretariat a higher authority in proposing trade negotiations, in proposing solutions, in proposing options. This notion that the WTO is a member-driven organization, frankly speaking, makes it very inefficient as compared to other international organizations, the efficiency on which, on average, is at least, if it's about setting the process to adopt rules and to monitor them, a bit better. Final point, and this has already been made, although in a more diplomatic way than I will do it, all this will not happen without the US outside the WTO. The reality for the moment is that the US have not rejoined the World Trade Organization. They, of course, are a member formally, but there's nothing like a track record of proper activity, of proper initiative, of proper proposals that can be credited to the US. And this is something, in my view, which really needs to be addressed in the future. We will not have a better WTO without a better contribution of the US to the WTO. And what we've had for the last 10 years, frankly, is pretty disappointing. Sorry for being so blunt, but I think this sort of dialogue is also about making things clear. Over to you, Hank.
Yes. So, Pasquale, thank you for that. And now, Wendy, to you.
Okay, just a few concluding thoughts. First, with respect to the IPEF, I think we all need to keep an open mind. We don't know the details yet. They will be rolled out soon. The Biden administration understands the stakes are high. So again, I think we need to await before we pass judgment. I think the IPEF can be a first step, and we can build on it over time. And I'd also caution people, and some of the best trade negotiators ever on this line, that going in positions aren't always where you end up. So digital may be liberated from the rest of the initiative, as Kevin suggested. Perhaps market access in some limited ways will be put on the table. Second, I just want to underscore something that Jeff said I think is really important with respect to China tariffs. We need a robust and urgent exclusion system process where companies and workers and others can come in and get exceptions from the high tariff rates. Third, India, I couldn't agree more with Kevin. We need to watch India. It's not just their latest agreement with Australia. They just concluded an FTA with the UAE. They're negotiating with the UK and others. So maybe there's some openings here. I have to say, throughout my career, negotiating with India wasn't something that was very career enhancing because success was elusive, but maybe things are changing. And finally, with respect to the WTO, I couldn't agree more with Pascal. We need it. We may not like it in terms of its lack of accomplishments. And to succeed, I really think that plurilaterals are the way to go, where subsets of WTO countries can come together, work on issues that they care about, and over time see if other members want to join. But if plurilaterals are somehow blocked and we have to wait for agreements among consensus of 164 members, I think the WTO is just going to move into irrelevance.
Wendy, thank you very much. And thank you all. You've helped us sort through some complex and important questions. Also, a very big thanks to Senator Coons and Senator Sullivan for their opening insights, and to John and the CSIS for your partnership. Inflection point is an overused term, but Russia's invasion of Ukraine is almost certainly going to be a geopolitical and a geoeconomic inflection point. I, for one, hope it serves as an impetus for the U.S. to lead in developing and implementing a trade agenda that helps make the world more peaceful, stable, and prosperous. That won't be easy, and there'll be a lot more to say about global trade in the months and years ahead. But you all have given our audience a useful framework to think about these issues. Thank you, everyone.